What's the most shocking thing you found out about a family member after they died? Story 1. My great-uncle David aid members of his family. I only knew him as a gruff, kindly, feeble, bedridden old man with one lung. The only inkling I ever got that there was something off about him was one day when I was about 8, and I was playing with a ball in the driveway. I happened to glance up at Uncle Davy's bedroom window and saw him peering down at me. As I smiled and waved at him, I thought he was making a face, like adults sometimes do at kids. Then, the face he seemed to pull simply didn't change. He was staring at me, face contorted, and the chummy, avuncular old man was now fixing me with this unsettling, fiendish, rodent-like gaze. If you want to picture it, imagine an elderly Lee Van Cleef staring fixedly and intently at you, like a ghoul. I found it disturbing, and quickly stopped my play and went indoors to my grandparents, who lived in the next house. I remember I sat there watching television with them, and feeling unnerved by what I'd just seen. It was only much more recently that a Redditor helped me make sense of what I'd seen. The old man was likely playing with his joystick as he watched me. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. Not me, but my father found out that his sister was actually his mother. She'd been dead 40 years. He was raised by his grandparents while his sister lived abroad. She came home and lived with them, and died when he was a teenager. When I was a teenager, my father's only remaining uncle died, and one of his cousins told him after the funeral. She made the mistake of getting pregnant and not being married in 1930s Catholic Ireland. Her parents sent her to England and raised the child as their own. The alternative was for her and my father to end up in one of the Magdalene laundries that were known to treat these women worse than slaves and illegally adopt the children to wealthy Americans. My grandmother's burial is recorded, but the plot number is not noted in the public record, and there is no marker for her final resting place. My father died 26 years ago. To this day I cannot get a birth certificate for him, because one does not exist. Story 3. I can personally play a role in these stories. They're not family members, but one is something I just read, and the other is about someone my aunt knew. Neither she nor I are related to that guy, but both stories are horrific. I just finished a book on online violence against women, and one case mentioned involved a woman in the UK who spent several years as the full-time carer for her terminally ill husband. Because there is very limited payment for full-time carers, she descended into abject poverty and endured a horrible life in general. After his death, it was discovered that he had been drugging and essaying her Pelica style for years and had posted videos of it on porn sites. The man my aunt knew died of cancer at an older age. He wasn't a close friend, just an acquaintance. Think same running club. After his death, his adult daughter, also an acquaintance, found barrels containing the bodies of several women's workers he had killed, among his possessions in a rented storage locker. Story 4. My dad died 5 days before I was born, so these stories were told to me 20 and 21 years later because my mom wanted me to only know the good stuff about him while I was growing up. We were watching a Lost Love segment on Unsolved Mysteries when my mom pipes up and says, "Your dad cheated on me and got another girl pregnant." I was surprised, and she said that they argued, and he hooked up with a friend's sister, and she got pregnant. My mom said the girl showed up at the hospital after my dad died, and said they would need to raise their kids together. Now, my mom was very overdue with me and was extremely emotional because of the situation, and she went off on the girl and told her to get lost and forget about my dad. My mom never heard from her again, but did hear that she had her kids a couple of months later and gave them up. So, I have possibly 2 other siblings out there somewhere. The next story I was told was like a year later. My dad was considered an incorrigible preteen at 12. Because my grandma didn't like his attitude, so she sent him to live with the local school football coach. The coach was more interested in the boys than he should have been, and he went after my dad. My dad fought him and told him if he ever tried again, he would off him. Well, the coach tried again, and my dad shot him. My dad was charged with ending life and spending from 19 inches Julie. The coach was honored with having the football field named after him. After my dad died, other kids came forward about the coach, but nothing happened. I understand why my mom didn't tell me these things about my dad when I was growing up, but it was very shocking to find them out when I was already an adult. Story 5. Grandpa had a French lover who would come around every couple of years and would sleep with both grandparents, which sounds really awesome and poly until I was also informed that Grandma hated this and neither wanted to share her husband nor participate with the French woman, as both my mom and uncle referred to her as, so that became unfathomably worse. It's something hard to believe my grandfather would do to my grandmother, but it also explains a lot of the anger my uncle has towards him specifically after death. Story 6. I've got a good one. My husband passed away unexpectedly after a week in the hospital. He had an infection that attacked his heart, and they couldn't get it under control well enough to safely operate. In the end, he passed away. As if that wasn't bad enough, one night I got a call from the hospital asking if a certain person was authorized to visit him after hours. That person turned out to be his girlfriend. No, we did not have an open relationship, by the way. A few months later, I found out through Facebook that this very same girl was pregnant. She posted pictures from her baby shower, and some of the decorations included photos of her and my husband, the father of her baby. What really hit me was seeing that my husband's family had liked some of those photos. So I called my mother-in-law and said, "Hey there, so when were you going to tell me about this?" Her response? "Never." Yep, that's a direct quote. That was a little under 2 years ago, and I am still dealing with the fallout from all of it. These very same in-laws have recently been bugging me about when I am going to drive a few hours to come stay with them so they can see my children. Should I respond with never? By the way, I am not keeping my children from their grandparents before anyone comes for me. We've visited them a couple of times, and they're welcome to visit us here anytime. But I am no longer comfortable letting them keep my children on their own, because I simply don't trust them anymore. So yeah, that's what's going on in my life. Story 7. I always knew that my Australian great-grandfather moved to Canada shortly before the turn of the last century. Supposedly, he came here for his health. He passed away when I was very young. A few years ago, more than a century after he met my great-grandmother at church and married her after a whirlwind courtship, my sister decided to Google his very distinctive name, just out of curiosity. Turns out he had been engaged to his Australian boss's daughter and was simultaneously involved with a mistress who became pregnant. He helped arrange a back-alley abortion, but the mistress died from complications. In response, he helped strip and shave her body, placed it in a carrying case, and pushed it out to sea. The case holding her remains was later found floating, and it became a huge story in Australia. He was caught, convicted of ending someone's life, and barely escaped hanging. I don't know how he got released or how he managed to make his way to Canada, but yeah, I guess you could say he came here for his health, all right? Story 8. My grandmother died at 2017 at age 91. After she passed, I went through her address book to let people know. One of the people I called was a man named Bill, whom my grandmother had dated in the 80s when I was a kid. Bill had been a handsome silver-haired gent who was always well-dressed and drove big convertibles, which I thought was super cool. He was an airline pilot, and in World War II he had flown supply missions over the hump from India into mainland China. For those who don't know, flying over the hump meant crossing the Himalayas, which the plane could just barely do, and when you landed you were running on fumes. It was an incredibly dangerous and difficult mission, and he did it literally dozens of times. So yeah, the dude was the epitome of old school cool. He and my grandmother dated for around 10 years. They especially loved to go dancing, and my grandmother had tons of pictures of them at fancy dance clubs, etc., all dressed to the nines. They had a good time together, and even after they stopped dating, they stayed in touch as friends. So, I called Bill to let him know what happened, except Bill didn't answer. His son did. It turns out that Bill had also died not long before, well into his 90s. Dude was still driving for Meals on Wheels at 90, and here's where it got weird. See, it turns out that Bill had been married that whole time. My grandmother was the other woman. Apparently, Bill had left his wife and kids for her, but I didn't know any of this at first, so I just breezily said, "Oh, Bill and my grandmother used to date," and then went on to talk about what a nice guy he was, like a grandfather figure, taking me for rides in the convertible and talking about planes, etc., etc. So basically, I was bragging about what a great paternal role model Bill was to his actual son, to whom he had been a crappy father. Ouch. I felt like an a-hole, and if I had known, I never would have framed it the way I did, or maybe even told him at all. He was understandably a little upset, but I think he was at least glad to know the truth. I sent him some scanned images of his father. I cropped my grandmother out of them, and never heard from him again. I hope he found some closure. Story 9. I don't know if it's the worst, but it was definitely sad. My uncle had multiple strokes and dementia. Before he died, he kept asking for his wife, who passed away many years ago. The thing is, he kept calling another woman's name in between, asking, "Where's my wife?" And I thought it was just dementia rambling. After he passed away, I found out it was the name of a girl he was in love with, his old neighbor, almost 70 years ago in Morocco. Her family and ours didn't let them get married because she's Muslim and he's Jewish. She was married off, and our family a few years later moved away, and they've never seen each other since. Still, he talked about her on his deathbed. Story 10. After my stepmom died, my dad couldn't bring himself to clean out her things. I spent almost 3 weeks going through her clothes and belongings to either toss or donate to their church. While sorting, I found a collection of day planners she'd used, not just as planners but also as mini journals, sometimes jotting down a few sentences about the day's events. These dated back to the 80s. I flipped through them, thinking I'd let my dad decide if he wanted to read them. She had a quirky personality, and some of the entries were genuinely funny. I got to the entries where she met my dad, and those were very sweet. She seemed to really love him. Then I reached the month she met me. It turns out, she absolutely hated me. I was 12 years old when they got married, and she raved about being jealous of the time my dad and I spent together. He had custody of me every other weekend, and at least a week's vacation during the summer. Because he worked afternoons, during summer he would pick me up from my mom's in the morning and take me to my grandma's to hang out all day while he did laundry or chores around the house for her. Sometimes we'd play video games or go to the pier. I only saw him about 8 or 9 days a month during the school year, so I loved this time with him. Reading about how upsetting it made someone else I loved felt like a hard slap in the face. To my face, she was always very sweet, asking about schoolboys and my friends. She always remembered everyone's names and what I told her. She knew my favorite foods and colors, and always found amazingly thoughtful gifts for Christmas or my birthday. But while she was journaling, she wrote how dumb she thought I was. I was always taking honors classes, by the way. How superficial she thought I was, and how sure she was that I planned bad things, like a breakup or a fight with a friend, just to steal my dad's attention. She wrote about how mad she got when he wanted me to join them on vacation. They spent several weeks every year traveling, visiting family, fishing, and camping, always just the two of them, and only 1 week a year did I get to go. I ended up throwing them all away and never told my dad. Story 11. I was financially abused. My mom decided she wanted a marketable rate for my room. I wasn't allowed to move out either because according to her I wouldn't be able to cope on my own. Unofficially, I started looking at some house and flat shares, which were actually cheaper than what I was being charged for my room. That's when she doubled down and insisted I wasn't capable of living independently. I accepted it. Years later, while clearing out her old paperwork, I discovered that I had been paying more in rent for my room than she was paying for the entire flat. Looking back, it all fell into place. From the moment I turned 16, she kept saying she wanted to be rewarded for raising me. Story 12. I found out at my grandfather's funeral that he wasn't my biological grandfather. I was standing by the casket crying. I was 15, and my aunt said, "Why are you crying so hard? He wasn't even your grandfather." On the way home, I asked my parents why my crazy aunt said that. Turns out she was right. My mom said, "Oh, I thought you knew. We must have talked about it before you were born." Turns out, not only was my grandfather's my dad's stepdad, but also he had tried to off my dad at one point. My dad just said, "Yeah, times were different back then." I was like, what the hell is wrong with my family? Story 13. My uncle's brother-in-law, not blood-related, passed away at 45 after struggling with alcoholism. He lived with us for nearly 10 years in a joint family setup during my childhood. I had only positive memories. He was the fun uncle who'd hang out with us during cousins' sleepovers. When I was around 8, my mom suddenly told me I could no longer sleep in the living room with him and the other kids. I didn't ask why. He moved out shortly after to live in a motel run by my uncle for the remainder of his life. 20 years later, I am one of the few who went to his funeral. I even gave a speech about the warm, funny man I remembered before addiction took over. Afterward, I called my elder sister, wondering why she did not attend. That's when she told me he had ate her for the entire time he lived with us and was inappropriate with a few other elder female cousins. She was too scared to go into further detail. I've never mustered up the courage to ask my parents how they could hide this from me and allow us to go to his funeral. Story 14. I found an old revolver in a chest belonging to my grandmother when we helped her move states. Apparently, my grandfather bought it because he was slowly going insane and paranoid and planned to off everyone in the family with it. She managed to hide it away from him and convince him that he'd misplaced it somewhere. Eventually, he just forgot about it, but she kept it just in case he figured out another way to try. Kinda eerie to think about as an adult, that a family member that showed you unconditional love when you were a child had a .38 special and a box of rounds with everyone's name figuratively on them. Story 15. I have only faint memories of my great-grandfather. To little kid me, he was this funny white-haired old guy who always wanted to have a pillow fight with me or give me sweets. Years later, after he was long gone, my dad informed me that he'd actually tried to SA my mom when she was a little girl, but she managed to escape. It's baffling that he was still part of the family, and my great-grandmother didn't kick him out. It's even more baffling that my granddad, his son-in-law, a hard-buns Glaswegian who wasn't shy about getting into fights in his youth, didn't straight up end him. Maybe they kept it from him, but it's weird that my dad would know about it, and it seemed to be this dark family secret that nothing was done about. Times were different, I guess. What fills me with dread is whether my dad only gave me the abridged version of the story. My grandmother, his daughter, and all her sisters grew up kind of, not necessarily bitter but snarky and world-weary. Makes me wonder what they were subjected to growing up to make them that way. Story 16. I never met my paternal grandfather. All I know is that my grandmother told me I look like him and that he was a seafarer just like a lot of the men in his community and family. Because of his job, my dad and the rest of his family when he was a child were able to live a comfortable middle-class life with vacations and even their own land. He passed long before my parents even met due to smoking and drinking. Afterward, Dad had to quickly learn how to live on his own as his family grew poor without the income. I only found out more about him once I talked to my dad more often, and as it turns out, he actually hated him. He never specified why, but later on he said that the old man punished him and two of his younger brothers via humiliation on a regular basis. He would force the three of them to kneel on dried beans while unclothed and on the side of the road where everyone passing by could see them. It could be very well why Dad is super easily embarrassed around crowds. Yet he also stated that he has come to terms with this as there was no point in wasting energy over being angry at a dead man. Story 17. When my grandmother died, we discovered papers that confirmed my uncle had conned her into signing over her extreme wealth and to take on his excessive debt in return. We also discovered additional papers that stated she would be taken care of by my uncle with her money, and it was all done in order for him to continue operating his business and practice. She loved her son, my uncle, and once he got his hand in the family money, he slowly edged her out of his life and started calling her crazy. All she was trying to do was get in contact with him to get access to her money as he promised so she could live life and pay her bills. He ghosted the whole family prior to her death. It breaks me that she died with a broken heart and couldn't tell us what he had done to her all because she loved him and had no inkling he would ever do this to her. Story 18. When my husband and I were planning to start a family, I became interested in my family history. My father's family history was well documented back to the time they arrived from England and Germany. The same was true for my husband's Irish ancestors. My mother's side was a complete void. Past my maternal grandparents, I knew nothing. She was from Mexico. I tried writing to both the vital records and the archdiocese in the state she was born. Nothing. My mother was born in 1921. Since she was a naturalized citizen, I wrote immigration. They sent a copy of her whole immigration file. I found out many things. 1. She made herself a year younger. 2. My mother was born out of wedlock with no father listed, and her legal name was my grandmother's maiden name. That didn't stop my grandmother from calling herself Mrs. Martinez versus Miss Rodriguez and calling my mother Maria Martinez versus who she really was, Maria Rodriguez. My grandparents never married. My grandma brought my mother here when my mother was a young child, and while my grandma had a visa, she didn't get one for my mother since she was a child, and my grandma didn't know my mother needed one. When my mother applied for a green card at age 20, immigration figured out she never had a visa, but that was a minor paperwork issue at the time. What immigration had a problem with was giving a green card to someone with no legal father. So, my grandma filed a paternity suit in Mexico, and my grandfather acknowledged paternity. My mother was 20. It was only at that point that her name legally became Maria Martinez. Not even my father knew any of this. At that point, he had been widowed for several years. When I told him, he said, "Wow, after 41 years of marriage you think you know someone." Story 19. Do cousins-in-law count? I found out that my second oldest cousin's first husband had been cheating on them and beating them. He got the other woman, the one he was cheating with, pregnant. After my cousin left him, that woman ended up living with him, and he started beating her too. One day she called the cops on him. When they arrived, he pulled out a gun and threatened to off himself if they got any closer. He followed through and offed himself. My cousin said the only reason they wanted to go to his funeral was to make sure he was actually dead. Story 20. This isn't about something a relative did, nor did I know the relative personally, but it's about what happened to them. My grandmother lost her mother when she was 12, to tuberculosis. Her mother had spent the last 3 years of her life in the hospital. My grandmother's stories about visiting her, and how bad things got toward the end, have always been heartbreaking to hear. Last year, I helped my grandmother obtain the death certificates for both of her parents, which were needed for a life insurance claim her brother was handling. She had always known her mother died of tuberculosis, had seen how frail and sick she had become in that final year. But when we received the death certificate, it not only confirmed tuberculosis as the cause of death, it also listed early signs of syphilis as a contributing factor. That's how I unintentionally helped my 93-year-old grandmother learn that her mother had likely been SA'd while sick, dying, and helpless in a hospital at the end of her life. Story 21. My grandma was a gambling addict her whole life until her 60s, when my grandpa threatened to leave her. She sought help and stopped. Years went by, and my dad put her in charge of my disabled sister's disability money because we had nobody else who could. Every month, she would give my sister a bit of money, and we thought everything was fine. My sister had about $8,000 in savings. When Grandma died last year, she told my dad, "I promise I didn't touch my sister's money." My dad thought that was a strange thing to say. After she passed, he realized she had gambled all the money away. We haven't told anyone else in the family, not even my sister. We don't want my grandma's image to be tainted, so we all step in and help my sister with money now. Story 22. This isn't very scandalous, but it was at the time apparently. After my grandfather died, they found an old photo of a young woman in his wallet. No one knew who she was, not even my grandmother. It was a mystery for many years. One of my aunts had a pretty extensive genealogy project going on and shifted her focus. She even had a hard time tracking the woman down. She finally was able to get a story. At least something of one. The woman was his first wife. No one even knew he had been married previously. They got married, he got an apartment for her. Then left, never going back as far as anyone knows. No divorce records were ever found. She had a common maiden name like Smith, so my aunt was never able to track down with any reliability what happened to her. This all happened in rural Michigan in the early 1930s, so records were sparse. My grandfather went on to marry my grandmother a few years later. They had 11 kids together and never hinted at a previous marriage. The speculation is he got the woman pregnant, and was forced to marry her. There of course is probably more to it than that, but that is all lost to us now. Story 23. This isn't quite after she died, but she had been many years fully mentally gone at this point and died not long after the revelation, so it still counts in my mind. We mourned her loss already, despite her body still going like a zombie for so long. When I was 16, my grandmother, crying and emotional, gave me a ring to keep. She said she would tell me the story behind it when I was older. A simple tarnished silver band with raw turquoise. No markings, possibly handmade. Years and ages later, my abusive grandfather had already passed, and my grandmother was in the last stage of Alzheimer's and had refused to tell us why the ring was so important to her before she couldn't. She would get emotional and say, "Not yet." We had rumors, but nothing solid. A couple of months before her passing, an old man around her age gets in touch with the family with help from his kids. Long story short, he and Grandma were engaged, but her abusive family wouldn't allow the marriage. When her family was going to move to Europe from the US, she and he couldn't find each other to elope before the move. So, in desperation to stay stateside away from her abusive family, she married my grandfather, whom she had barely met within days of the upcoming move. Her first lost love and her never found each other through the years until it was far too late, and we were unable to have him see Grandma before she passed due to his health issues not allowing flying, and the drive would have been far too long at his age and health. It was absolutely heartbreaking to hear the story, especially knowing how terrible my grandfather was to her. Her entire life, except the last few months, was around a horrid and abusive family husband overlapped with Alzheimer's for some 15 years or so, taking her mind early on and leaving just her body behind for many years. I still keep the ring and wear it from time to time, but sometimes it makes me so sad for her. How much she must have mourned the life and love she could have had, how trapped she was all her life. At the same time, it inspires me to fight for my happiness and reminds people around me as well. No one should have a life lived like that. I wish she had told me sooner. Perhaps we could have found him decades before. Poor thing. I heard he's passed as well now, so I like to think they are finally together and happy. Story 24. The real reason my husband was estranged from his father was because he had SA'd him and his sisters, and he didn't want our son around him. He had told me it was because his dad had been physically abusive, which was also true, but not about the SA part. He couldn't talk about it until his dad passed away. Story 25. My nan pretended my dad never existed. My dad was a caring, loving person. He would fly up to visit her and help her whenever she needed it. She moved away from the whole family to live in a warmer climate. My mom even took time off work to help care for her when she had cancer alongside my auntie. At the funeral, all of her friends up where she lived didn't know my dad existed. They knew about my auntie and my cousins. They even knew about my no-good gambling addict uncle who did nothing but siphon money off everyone, but not my dad. Obviously not my mom, me, or my sister, either. My dad was crushed. Seeing the sadness in his eyes was just horrible. I know this isn't as wild as someone who was responsible for ending someone or hiding giant secrets, etc., but it was just the cruelest thing she could have done to a good man, a good son. Story 26. That she'd fallen victim to a financial scam and never told any of us about it. When my grandmother died and we were going through her things, we found a series of letters from a man claiming to be a long-lost cousin of some sort asking for money, and another series of letters between her and her bank, desperately trying to get her money back. Once they'd flagged that she might have been a victim of fraud. From what we could tell, she got at least some of the money back. She'd given him over $20,000, but I was absolutely bawling my eyes out at the thought of my grandmother having to go through that without any help or being able to talk to anyone in the family, in her 80s, while in an assisted living home. I still get really upset whenever I think about it. Freak anyone taking advantage of old people. Story 27. I don't know if this counts as found out, but after my grandma died, her son, who did not know me at all, showed me a video of my grandma yelling in the hospital bed mid-death rattle moments before she died. Why would you show something like that to a child you do not know? Story 28. The great-grandmother offed her first husband a hammer. He was caught trying to get touchy with their daughter. The judge refused to even have a trial. Basically, told the prosecutor no jury on the planet would blame her. The newspaper clippings were discovered amongst her photo albums after she passed. Story 29. 20 years after my grandfather, whom I absolutely adored, passed away, I found out he had an affair shortly after my mother was born and had a daughter he never acknowledged. My mom and her siblings only discovered their half-sister well into their 40s, but they never got the chance to meet her. My grandfather had wanted nothing to do with the child and eventually lost touch with both her and the woman he had the affair with. Story 30. My nan's mother tried to drown her as a newborn baby. She was caught in the act, taken off to the local insane asylum, and then raised by her aunt, who we called Big Nan, and assumed she was her biological mother. Not a bad thing to find out about my assumed biological great nan, but mentally that 4 generations almost never existed because of my nan's biological mum. Story 31. My grandfather had basically disowned my uncle when my uncle came out and also revealed that he was HIV positive. I hadn't seen my uncle in so long that I almost forgot he was my uncle. We got reacquainted at the funeral. Probably the most fun funeral I've been to since we got along so well. Thankfully, I got to know him for at least a few years before he passed from complications. Still wish we could have had a better goodbye. Story 32. I recently started subscribing to a site that has searchable archives of almost every newspaper in the country since the early 1900s. So, naturally, I started searching the names of random people that I used to know but lost track of. I discovered that my grandfather did time in federal prison for burglary and kidnapping. This occurred when my mother was around 3 years old, so he went to prison for a few years, leaving my grandmother to fend for herself with 6 young children. I knew my mother had a hard life, but she rarely talked about it, so this gave me a little insight. There were no records of any other convictions, so he apparently straightened his life out after that. Story 33. That my grandpa violently beat my grandma to the point where she jumped out of a second-floor window in their house to get away from him. My grandma told me all of this while I helped her take care of him in his dementia state in the hospital. Made it really difficult for me to want to help him. Story 34. I helped a friend of mine clean out her mom's house after her mom passed away. We found a trunk in the bedroom, and after I cut off the lock, we discovered stacks of Penthouse Forum magazines. After the initial laugh, we started pulling them out. Then we found manuscripts. It turned out my friend's mom was a writer for Penthouse Forum. The magazines were issues that featured her published stories, and the manuscripts were rough drafts. She even had awards from Penthouse for her writing, along with letters from readers thanking her for helping them realize their identity. Her specialty was writing stories about lesbian and bi women experiencing awakenings. Story 35. I was going through my father's computer to see what accounts he had to cancel them. When I opened the history, I found that for a solid day, a full 24 hours, he was just watching nonstop porn. Like the time stamps showed, he was clicking on a new link every few minutes. All different categories. I laughed pretty hard when I saw that about halfway through, he stopped for a few minutes to order Gatorade on Amazon, then went back to the corn. I very quickly deleted it and decided to just completely factory reset the computer and never talk about it with anyone, especially my brother. Story 36. My Aunt Mary lived on a homestead at the back of our family farm. She had been the last little old lady of her group who could still drive. Her car was a battleship-sized Buick Electra, 225. The front seat was like a living room couch, and the console could have hosted dinner for 5. One day, she backed out of a parking space at a grocery store on her way to bingo with her friends and clipped a police car that was parked in a fire lane in front of the store. The damage to the cop car was substantial and her trunk wouldn't close. When the officer attempted to tie it shut, he discovered 12 mason jars of white liquor in a plastic Hoffman soda crate. In 1974, my Aunt Mary was arrested for bootlegging. A few months later, she passed away. When we entered her house to clean, we discovered the full extent of her operation. A 50-gallon cook pot still was set up in her basement, along with hundreds of jars and sacks of sugar. It literally took 10 trips with the farm flatbed to clear it out. We also found ledger books dating back to the 1920s. My dad recognized some of the names, local politicians, and the old police chief. Story 37. I am not sure what to believe with this one, but after my mother passed, my aunt randomly told my husband, not me, that my mother used to beat the crap out of me when I was a very small child. I had a few injuries around age 3 that I don't remember sustaining. My mom always gave me a very scripted explanation of how those things happened, usually blaming my sister who was only a year and a half older than me. So, I never really questioned it. But my mom was a negligent parent and emotionally abusive, so I wouldn't be shocked if my aunt was telling the truth. The problem is, my aunt is just as messed up as my mom was, so it's hard to know what to trust. That said, there are definitely a small handful of lifelong cigarette burn scars. If anyone read that and is curious, I had all 4 of my top front teeth broken in half, which required emergency surgery. My mom said my sister pushed me down onto a pipe. The other injury was a gash on my face that needed 7 stitches. My mom claimed it happened from me jumping on the bed and hitting the wall. She loved to brag about CPS being sent out after that one. According to her, they took one look around at all the toys and books and said, "I think we're good here," then left without ever even stepping inside the house. Story 38. My mom had another older brother, or was supposed to. I knew he died, but when I got older, my grandma told me the details. During birth, the doctor yanked the baby by the head, which dislocated his shoulder blades. He was in agony for days because they couldn't or wouldn't fix it, and he died as an infant. My grandparents were traumatized but couldn't do anything because the doctor was a high-ranking military officer, and this was a few years before the military dictatorship in my country. They were terrified their safety could be at risk, so the incident was never brought to justice, and my grandpa didn't take any action. My grandma was left deeply traumatized and only had C-sections after that. My grandpa died a few years after my mom was born during the military dictatorship. According to grandma, he had a stroke within the first year or so due to stress, and then he passed away. Story 39. My dad, who struggled with and eventually died from his alcoholism, was a fairly prolific writer. He left behind chapters of writings that were supposed to be his memoir. It took a few years for the rawness of his unexpected passing for me to pick them up and read them, but I learned he was the victim of multiple instances of SA, once by an older boy at Boy Scouts, then again when he was a teen at summer camp that was associated with the Catholic Church. He was the oldest of 10 from an Irish Catholic family, and no one believed him, so he started to bottle it up. He resettled in a different part of the country, and eventually met my mom. After years of him coping with his trauma with alcohol, my mom filed for divorce, only for him to call the night before it was finalized, telling her everything and begging her to reconsider. She kindly and compassionately wished him well with unpacking all of that, and urged him to seek help, but she said firmly she still intended to go through with the divorce. After that was a slow spiral. I don't think he told my stepmom, who also ended up leaving him, and he eventually died alone in a trailer after drinking himself to death before the age of 60. There have been countless moments when I find myself wishing he was still here, but then I remind myself he is no longer suffering from a pain that was too heavy to carry, and much too heavy to talk about or heal from. R.I.P. Dad. Story 40. My maternal grandmother was the most judgmental and spiteful person I've ever met. My husband and I met and started dating in high school in 2002. When we turned 22, we moved into an apartment together. After a year of living together, he proposed. At my bridal shower, my grandmother stood up in front of family, friends, and co-workers and told everyone I was living in sin, that I was a floozy for living with a man I wasn't married to. She tried to rally everyone to shame me for my choices. I died a little inside. It was mortifying. She passed away less than a year ago, and all the secrets are coming out. She got pregnant at 15 and abandoned that child, who's now homeless somewhere in Arizona. She had several affairs after marrying at 16, and at least 3 of her 5 children have different fathers. I hope you're up there, Grandma, watching me. I want you to see that the person I've become is better than you'll ever be. Story 41. Not me, but my mom got on Ancestry.com, maybe 10 years ago, and found a whole family of older half-brothers and sisters. Turns out, my grandpa, who had already passed away by this time, had run out on an entire family he started in his 20s and never told my grandma before they got married. He also bailed on my grandma, mom, and two uncles a few years after my mom was born. He ran off with some chick who was 30 years younger than him, and she was his caretaker until he died. Crazy to think how easy it was for people to get away with crap like that before the internet. Story 42. My dad passed away in December, and I've been the one cleaning out my parents' home since my mom moved to an independent living facility. My parents met in the early 80s while they were both stationed in the Air Force in Germany. They got engaged after only a couple of months of dating and planned to get married back in the US. Since my dad didn't formally ask my mom's parents for her hand in marriage and wouldn't get to meet them beforehand, he wrote the sweetest letter to them. In the letter he shared how much he loves my mom and how he felt he would never find the right person and started to believe maybe marriage wasn't in the cards for him until he met her. He reassured them of his intentions, and the whole thing was written so eloquently. It was so nice to read after the hell my parents went through towards the end of his battle with cancer. It's often hard to remember the love that was there in the beginning as it morphs over time and becomes less like flowers and eloquent words and more, till death do us part. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.